I found the lipstick on his collar 3 hours after our wedding, while the sun was still bright enough to show me every detail of the betrayal, and I remember thinking with strange calm that I could see the exact shade of red against the white fabric, the same white as the dress I was still wearing. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet kind of hope that survives even the worst mornings of our lives, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel, because stories like mine only mean something when they are shared with people who still believe that broken things can be rebuilt. My name is Margaret Hollis, though everyone who loves me calls me Maggie, and on the day my life changed forever I was 29 years old, standing in a hotel suite overlooking the vineyards of Napa Valley, still wearing the wedding dress my mother had helped me choose 8 months earlier. The dress had cost more than my first car, but it wasn't the dress I was thinking about when I found the lipstick. I was thinking about the way my husband, Charles Whitfield, had kissed me at the altar just 6 hours before, how his hands had trembled slightly when he slid the ring onto my finger, how I had believed, with the full and foolish certainty of a woman in love, that I had found a partner who would stand beside me instead of in front of me. Charles was 34 then, already the CEO of Whitfield Dynamics, a logistics and technology company his grandfather had founded and his father had nearly run into the ground before Charles rebuilt it from the studs up. He was brilliant in the way that made rooms go quiet when he walked into them, the kind of man who could recite quarterly earnings from memory but somehow always forgot to call his mother on her birthday. I had met him at a charity gala 18 months before our wedding, back when I was working long hours as a financial analyst for a mid-sized investment firm, trying to claw my way up from an entry-level position my father used to joke I'd taken just to prove I could survive Wall Street's version of a Shark Tank. Charles had approached me not because I was the most glamorous woman in the room, but because I was the only person at his table who had actually read the annual report of the company being honored that night. He told me later that he fell for my mind before he fell for anything else, and for a long time I believed that meant I was safe from the kind of heartbreak that happens to women who are chosen for their faces instead of their minds. I was wrong, and I learned it on the happiest day of my life. The wedding itself had been beautiful, almost unbearably so. My younger sister, Rosalind, had cried through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her mascara with a handkerchief our grandmother had embroidered decades earlier. My father, a retired high school history teacher named Walter, had walked me down the aisle with his chin held so high I worried he might trip over the flower petals scattered across the grass. Charles's mother, a soft-spoken woman named Eleanor who had never fully recovered from the loss of her husband 2 years earlier, had squeezed my hand before the ceremony and told me that I was the daughter she never had. Everyone had been so happy. Everyone except, apparently, my husband, who had slipped away during the reception under the excuse of taking an urgent call from his Singapore office, only to return 40 minutes later smelling faintly of perfume that was not mine. I hadn't noticed at first. I was too busy being swept from table to table, thanking relatives I hadn't seen in years, laughing at my uncle's terrible jokes, dancing with my father to a song he had chosen specifically because it was the one he used to hum to me when I was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. It wasn't until we retreated to our honeymoon suite, giddy and exhausted, that I noticed the faint smudge of red on the collar of his tuxedo shirt as he shrugged it off and tossed it carelessly onto the chaise lounge near the window. The light coming through those tall hotel windows was still golden with late afternoon sun, and it caught the mark perfectly, illuminating it as if the universe itself wanted me to see. I asked him about it, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. He laughed it off, said one of his cousins had hugged him a little too enthusiastically, said I was imagining things, said I'd had too much champagne. But I hadn't had more than half a glass all day, a fact he would have known if he had been paying attention to me instead of his phone throughout most of the reception. I let it go that afternoon, not because I believed him, but because some small, frightened part of me wasn't ready to shatter the day I had spent a year planning. I told myself I would ask him properly once we returned from our honeymoon, once the exhaustion had faded and I could look at him without the haze of hurt clouding my judgment. The honeymoon was in Santorini, 10 days of white buildings against blue water, the kind of postcard beauty that should have healed the small crack already forming in my chest. Instead, it widened it. Charles took calls at odd hours, always stepping onto the balcony, always lowering his voice when I entered the room. He told me it was urgent negotiations for an overseas expansion, a merger that could double the company's valuation within 2 years. I wanted to believe him. I had spent my entire adult life training myself to read financial statements, balance sheets, cash flow projections, but somehow I had never learned to read the growing distance in my own husband's eyes. It was on the 6th night, though I promise this is the only nighttime moment I will describe because everything else that matters happened in daylight, that I overheard him on that balcony, speaking not about mergers but about someone named Vanessa, his voice soft in a way I hadn't heard him use with me in months, if ever. I did not confront him then either. Instead, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, mapping out in my analytical mind every strange absence, every late night at the office in the months before our wedding, every time he'd claimed to be handling investor relations when his assistant had let it slip that he'd left the building hours earlier. We returned home to Boston in early June, to the brownstone he had bought us as a wedding gift, the one with the wraparound porch and the garden I had already begun planning in my mind. On our first morning back, with sunlight pouring generously through the kitchen windows, I made us coffee and sat across from him at the Marble Island, and I asked him, calmly, plainly, whether he was having an affair. He didn't deny it the way I expected him to. He simply sighed, set down his cup, and told me that Vanessa Pierce was his director of corporate development, that things between them had started nearly a year before we married, that he had meant to end it but never found the right time, that he loved me in his own way but that what he felt for her was different, more exciting, less like a business arrangement and more like a fire he couldn't put out. He said all of this while looking not at me, but at his phone, as though I were a quarterly report he was mildly disappointed by rather than the woman he had promised his life to less than 3 weeks earlier. I want to tell you that I screamed, that I threw the coffee mug against the wall, that I did all the things a wounded woman is expected to do in that moment. But I didn't. Something in me went very still, very quiet, the way the ocean goes still right before a larger wave gathers itself in the distance. I remember thinking, with a clarity that frightened me, that I had spent my entire career learning how to read people who lied with numbers, and I was not about to let a man who lied with his mouth destroy everything I had built simply because he had decided I was no longer exciting enough for him. So I made a decision that morning, sitting at that Marble Island with the sun climbing higher through the windows. I decided I would not fall apart in front of him. I decided I would let him believe, for a little while, that he had won. I told Charles that I understood, that people grow and change, that perhaps I had rushed into marriage without fully considering what I wanted either. I watched the relief spread across his face, watched him relax his shoulders as though a great weight had been lifted, and I understood in that moment just how little he had ever truly known me. He believed, because it was convenient for him to believe, that I was the kind of woman who would simply accept humiliation and move quietly into the background of his glamorous, expanding life. He believed I would become one of those wives you see at company galas, smiling politely, drinking champagne, pretending not to notice the whispers. He did not know that I had spent the last 6 years of my career specializing in forensic accounting, that I could trace a dollar through 17 shell companies and still tell you exactly where it originated, that I had, in fact, already noticed several irregularities in Whitfield Dynamics' recent SEC filings during the months I had unofficially helped Charles review documents before our wedding, back when he still valued my mind enough to ask for my opinion. He did not know that my quiet acceptance that morning was not surrender. It was reconnaissance. Over the following weeks, I played the role of the devoted, understanding wife with a precision that would have made any actress proud. I attended his business dinners, laughed at the appropriate moments, complimented Vanessa Pierce's tailored blazers when we crossed paths at company events, all while cataloging every detail of what I observed. Vanessa was 31, sharp-featured, ambitious in the particular way that mistakes confidence for competence. She had joined Whitfield Dynamics 2 years earlier after a stint at a rival firm, and it did not take much digging I did quietly, methodically, during my lunch breaks and late evenings while Charles believed I was simply catching up on personal projects, to discover that her rapid rise through the company's ranks coincided suspiciously with a series of internal decisions that benefited her division far more than they benefited shareholders. My sister Rosalind noticed the change in me before anyone else did. She had always been the more emotionally expressive of the two of us, the one who cried at commercials and hugged strangers at parties, but she possessed an intuition about people that I, for all my analytical training, had never quite matched. She showed up at my house one Saturday afternoon in July, sunlight streaming through my kitchen windows exactly as it had the morning Charles confessed, and she asked me directly what was wrong. I nearly lied to her the way I had learned to lie to everyone else in those weeks, but something about her face, the genuine worry creasing her forehead, broke through the careful composure I had built. I told her everything, the lipstick, the confession, the affair, my decision to wait and watch rather than immediately confront and leave. Rosalind did not tell me I was foolish for staying, and she did not tell me I was wrong for wanting justice instead of simply walking away. Instead, she took my hand across the kitchen table and told me that our grandmother used to say that some storms cannot be outrun, only outlasted, and that the people who survive them are not the ones who scream the loudest but the ones who plant their feet the deepest. She offered to help me in whatever way I needed, and over the following months, she became one of the few people who knew the truth of what I was building. What I was building, piece by careful piece, was a case. Not just against Charles's infidelity, which was, in the grand scheme of corporate law, a private matter with limited legal consequence beyond the personal devastation it had caused me, but against the financial misconduct I had begun to suspect was happening beneath the surface of Whitfield Dynamics' glowing public image. I discovered, through documents Charles carelessly left on his home office desk, through late-night access to his laptop when he assumed I was asleep, through conversations I overheard while pretending to read on the porch during his calls, that Vanessa Pierce's division had been quietly funneling client contracts through a series of consulting firms that, upon closer examination, were owned by holding companies with only the thinnest paper connection to legitimate business operations. Money was moving in patterns that made sense only if you understood, as I did, the particular grammar of financial fraud. I did not act rashly. I understood, from years of watching cases unfold in the periphery of my career, that accusations without airtight evidence would be dismissed, buried, or worse, turned back against the accuser. Charles was not merely my husband, he was the CEO of a publicly traded company with a legal team large enough to make any lawsuit against him a slow and grinding war of attrition. If I moved too soon, too emotionally, I would lose, and worse, would hand him the narrative he already seemed to want, that of the wronged husband dealing with an unstable, vindictive wife. So I waited. I smiled at dinner parties. I let him believe our marriage, though quieter than before, was intact enough to serve his public image, which mattered enormously to him now that Whitfield Dynamics was in the middle of merger talks with a much larger conglomerate, a deal that would triple his personal wealth and cement his reputation as one of the youngest, most successful CEOs in the country. He needed, more than almost anything, the appearance of a stable home life to reassure investors and board members who valued the optics of a settled family man. I gave him exactly that appearance while I quietly gathered every piece of documentation I could find, cross-referencing it against public filings, consulting anonymously with a former colleague who now worked at the Securities and Exchange Commission, building a case not out of vengeance but out of the same discipline that had made me good at my job in the first place. During this time, I also began rebuilding pieces of myself that I hadn't realized I had let go dormant during our engagement and the early months of our marriage. I returned to running along the Charles River in the early mornings, watching the sun rise pink and gold over the water, feeling my lungs burn in a way that reminded me I was still alive, still capable of forward motion even when everything else felt frozen. I reconnected with old friends from graduate school, women who had watched me disappear into the whirlwind of Charles's world and who welcomed me back without judgment when I finally returned their calls. I spent long afternoons in my father's garden, helping him prune roses and listening to his stories about my mother, who had passed away when I was 22, stories that reminded me I came from people who had weathered their own storms and emerged, eventually, into calmer weather. By late September, I had assembled enough evidence, enough carefully documented financial irregularities, enough proof of the affair itself corroborated by hotel receipts, text messages I had photographed during unguarded moments, and testimony from a junior employee named Priya Malhotra who had witnessed enough to know something was deeply wrong and who trusted me enough, after months of careful, respectful conversation, to eventually come forward. I had built, essentially, two separate weapons. One was a case for divorce, ironclad and unassailable, that would ensure I walked away not as a discarded wife but as a woman who had documented every betrayal with the precision of someone who refused to be gaslit out of her own reality. The other was something far larger, a financial fraud case that, if pursued correctly, could bring down not just Charles's marriage but potentially his entire company. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because I know some of you listening might wonder whether the woman I am describing sounds cold, calculating, perhaps even frightening in her patience. I promise you I did not feel powerful during those months. I felt, more often than not, like I was drowning quietly in a room full of people who couldn't see the water rising around me. I cried in my car in grocery store parking lots. I called my sister at 2 in the afternoon, unable to speak for the first several minutes, simply needing to hear her voice reminding me I existed outside of my role as Charles's humiliated wife. What kept me moving forward was not anger alone, though anger was certainly present, but a deeper conviction that I owed it to myself, to the woman my mother had raised me to be, to walk out of this marriage with my dignity fully intact rather than shattered into pieces I would spend years trying to reassemble. The merger Charles had been pursuing was set to close in early November, at a gala event in downtown Boston that would be attended by board members, major shareholders, financial journalists, and virtually every important figure in the city's business community. Charles had been planning this event for months, viewing it as the crowning achievement of his career, the moment that would transform Whitfield Dynamics from a respected regional company into a national powerhouse. He had asked me, 3 weeks before the event, to stand beside him at the gala, to play the role of supportive wife one final, crucial time before the deal was finalized. I told him, with a smile I had practiced in the mirror more times than I care to admit, that of course I would be there. What Charles did not know was that I had spent the preceding weeks working closely with my former colleague at the SEC, a woman named Diane Castellano who had once been my mentor during an internship years earlier, ensuring that the evidence I had gathered was not just compelling but legally actionable. I had also, with Priya Malhotra's careful and courageous help, obtained a signed affidavit detailing the fraudulent contract routing scheme, evidence that would be devastating not just to Charles's reputation but to the merger itself, since the acquiring company's due diligence team had apparently, remarkably, missed the irregularities I had uncovered through nothing more than persistence and a forensic accountant's stubborn attention to detail. I could have gone to the authorities quietly, weeks before the gala, and let the investigation unfold behind closed doors. Diane advised me, in fact, that this would be the cleaner, more legally sound approach. But something in me, something that had been simmering since the moment I found that lipstick stain glowing red in the afternoon sun, needed Charles to understand, publicly and unmistakably, that the woman he had dismissed as too naive, too trusting, too easily managed, had been the architect of his downfall all along. I needed him to look at me, in front of everyone whose respect he valued most, and understand exactly what he had lost the day he decided I was disposable. The morning of the gala, I woke early, before the sun had fully risen, and went for my usual run along the river. The autumn light was crisp and clean, the kind of light that makes everything look sharper, more honest somehow. I remember standing at the railing overlooking the water, watching rowers glide past in their long, narrow boats, and feeling something settle inside me, a calm certainty that whatever happened that evening, I would walk into it as myself, fully and completely, rather than as the diminished shadow Charles had spent months trying to convince me I should become. I spent the afternoon with Rosalind, who helped me get ready not for Charles's benefit but for my own. She curled my hair the way our mother used to, laughing at old memories to keep the mood light even as we both understood the weight of what was coming. My father called just before I left, his voice steady and warm, reminding me that whatever happened, I had already proven myself capable of surviving far more than most people ever have to. Whitfield Dynamics Gala was held in the grand ballroom of a historic hotel downtown, the kind of venue with soaring ceilings and enormous windows that, even in the early evening, still caught the last golden light of a late autumn sunset spilling across the polished floors. I arrived on Charles's arm, dressed in deep emerald, a color I had chosen deliberately because it was the color he had once told me made me look, in his words, unstoppable. He seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly, rehearsing his speech under his breath, entirely consumed by the magnitude of what he believed was about to be the greatest achievement of his professional life. He did not notice Diane Castellano standing near the back of the room, dressed unassumingly, watching the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what was about to unfold. He did not notice Priya Malhotra, invited under the guise of a junior representative from her division, standing near the stage with a quiet, steady resolve on her face. He did not, most importantly, notice me watching him with anything other than the practiced adoration I had spent months perfecting. The evening proceeded exactly as Charles had planned, at least initially. The chairman of the acquiring company delivered opening remarks praising Whitfield Dynamics' innovative growth strategy. Charles took the stage to thunderous applause, delivering a speech about vision, resilience, and the power of building something meaningful from the ground up, a speech that, I noted with a strange, detached irony, contained more genuine passion than anything he had said to me in the 8 months since our wedding. He spoke about integrity as a cornerstone of good business, about the importance of trust between leaders and the people who believed in them, and I watched the room nod along, utterly convinced by a man whose entire public identity was, by that point, resting on a foundation I had spent months quietly excavating from beneath his feet. It was during the question and answer portion of the evening, when journalists and shareholders were invited to raise questions about the merger, that Diane Castellano stepped forward. She identified herself clearly, her voice calm and professional, and asked Charles a single, precise question about the routing of client contracts through the consulting entities Vanessa Pierce's division had established over the preceding 18 months. The room did not immediately understand the significance of the question, but I watched Charles's face shift, watched the confident, practiced smile falter for just a fraction of a second before he recovered, dismissing the question as a misunderstanding of standard business practices. Diane did not press further in that moment. She had already done her part, planting the question publicly, ensuring it existed on record, in front of journalists whose notebooks I could see filling with the beginnings of a very different story than the one Charles had intended to tell that evening. The formal proceedings continued, contracts were signed, champagne was poured, and for a brief window, it seemed as though the evening might conclude exactly as Charles had envisioned. It was during the reception that followed, as guests mingled beneath those soaring windows now dark with early evening, that I finally approached Charles directly, away from the immediate crowd, near a quiet alcove where sunset's last amber light still lingered through tall glass panes. I asked him, quietly, whether he remembered our wedding day. He looked at me, confused by the question amid the celebration surrounding him, and told me of course he remembered, that it had been a beautiful day. I asked him whether he remembered what he had been doing during the 40 minutes he disappeared from our reception. His expression shifted, uncertainty creeping into his eyes as he began to understand that this was not simply nostalgic conversation. I told him, then, calmly and without raising my voice, that I had known about Vanessa since that very afternoon, that I had spent the last 5 months not grieving quietly in the background as he had assumed, but building a case, methodical and complete, documenting every irregularity in his company's finances that his affair had inadvertently exposed me to. I told him that Diane Castellano's question moments earlier had only been the beginning, that formal SEC filings were already prepared, that Priya Malhotra's affidavit was already in the hands of investigators, that the merger he had just celebrated signing would very likely be unwound within days once the full scope of the fraud became public. I watched the color drain from his face as understanding finally settled over him, watched him realize that the quiet, understanding wife he believed he had successfully managed into submission had, in fact, been the most dangerous adversary he would ever face. He asked me, his voice suddenly small in a way I had never heard from him before, why I hadn't simply left, why I hadn't simply confronted him months earlier and walked away with whatever settlement our prenuptial agreement afforded me. I told him the truth, which was that leaving quietly would have allowed him to rewrite the story, to cast himself as a man who had simply outgrown a marriage that no longer served his ambitions, while I would have been left to absorb whatever narrative his considerable resources chose to construct around my departure. I told him I refused to let that happen, that I owed myself the truth being known, publicly and completely, rather than buried beneath his carefully managed public relations machine. I want to be honest with you about what happened in the weeks that followed, because I think the truth matters more than a tidy, simple resolution. The fallout was significant. The merger collapsed within 4 days, as I had anticipated, once the acquiring company's legal team reviewed the SEC's preliminary findings and determined the risk was too great to proceed. Whitfield Dynamics stock price fell sharply, and Charles was forced to step down as CEO amid mounting investor pressure and the beginning of a formal federal investigation into the fraudulent contract routing scheme. Vanessa Pierce, facing her own separate legal exposure, resigned within the same week and, according to sources I no longer had reason to follow closely, left the state entirely to avoid the growing scrutiny surrounding her role in the scheme. Our divorce proceedings, which I filed the following week, were remarkably swift given the circumstances, largely because Charles, diminished and desperate to avoid further public humiliation, chose not to contest the terms I proposed. I did not seek to destroy him financially beyond what his own actions had already guaranteed. That was never truly my goal, despite how it might appear on the surface. What I wanted, more than his money, more than public vengeance, was simply for the truth to exist plainly in the world, unobscured by his charm or his resources or his practiced ability to make people believe whatever version of events served him best. I moved out of the brownstone in December, into a smaller apartment near the river where I could hear the water some mornings if I left my window cracked open. My sister helped me unpack boxes over a series of sunny weekend afternoons, and my father brought over furniture from his own basement, pieces that had once belonged to my mother, insisting they belonged with me now more than they belonged gathering dust in his storage. I returned fully to my career, and word of the case, though I was never publicly named in most of the coverage due to the sensitivity of the ongoing investigation, quietly circulated within financial circles. Several firms reached out in the months that followed, impressed by the thoroughness and precision of the fraud detection work that had, by then, become an open secret among people who understood how rare it was for someone to build a case of that magnitude essentially alone. I want to tell you about something that happened nearly a year later, because I think it matters more than the collapse of Charles's company or the finalization of our divorce. It was a warm Saturday morning in late spring, and I was at the farmer's market near my apartment, the kind of place filled with the smell of fresh bread and early strawberries, when I ran into Charles unexpectedly. He looked different, thinner, older somehow despite barely a year having passed, dressed simply in a way I had never once seen during our marriage, when even his weekend clothes had been carefully curated to project success. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, surrounded by the ordinary bustle of people shopping for vegetables and flowers, and he told me, quietly, that he had spent the past several months in therapy, trying to understand why he had done what he did, why he had thrown away something real for something that ultimately meant nothing lasting. He told me he wasn't asking for forgiveness, that he understood he hadn't earned the right to ask for anything from me, but that he wanted me to know he finally understood the value of what he had lost. I did not feel the surge of vindication I might have expected from that conversation. Instead, I felt something quieter, something closer to peace. I told him I hoped he continued the work of understanding himself, that I genuinely wished him well in whatever life he was rebuilding, and that I had, in the months since our divorce, found a kind of clarity and strength I hadn't known I was capable of. I told him that I had forgiven him, not because what he did was acceptable, but because carrying that anger indefinitely would have cost me more than it would ever cost him. Forgiveness, I had come to understand through months of reflection and, admittedly, several long conversations with a therapist of my own, was not something I offered for his benefit. It was something I claimed for mine. We parted ways that morning without bitterness, and I continued my walk through the market, buying peonies from a vendor I had come to know by name, the sunlight warm on my shoulders in a way that felt, for the first time in a very long while, entirely uncomplicated. In the 2 years since that morning, my life has taken shape in ways I could never have predicted while standing in that hotel suite in Napa Valley, staring at a lipstick stain that would eventually unravel everything I thought I understood about my future. I left my position at the investment firm to start a small forensic accounting consultancy with 2 former colleagues, work that has proven both professionally fulfilling and, in a strange way, deeply healing, as though each fraud I help uncover for other clients is a small act of restitution for the version of myself who once felt powerless in the face of someone else's deception. I remain close with Priya Malhotra, whose courage in coming forward changed the trajectory of the entire case, and who has since become one of my closest friends, someone I now consider family in every sense that matters. My sister Rosalind married last spring, in a small ceremony in our father's garden, surrounded by roses we had planted together during the difficult months of my own separation, and I stood beside her as her maid of honor, weeping the good kind of tears, the kind that come from watching someone you love build something real. I have not remarried, though I have, in recent months, begun seeing someone, a quiet, thoughtful man named Nathaniel who teaches high school mathematics and has never once, in the time I've known him, made me feel as though my intelligence or my strength was something to be managed or diminished. We are taking things slowly, deliberately, in a way that feels less like rushing towards some predetermined destination and more like genuinely discovering whether we belong in each other's lives. I no longer feel the need to prove anything to anyone, not to Charles, not to the business world that once watched my quiet unraveling of his empire with such fascination, not even to myself. I simply feel, most mornings now, like a woman who survived something enormous and came out the other side more fully herself than she had ever been before. If you have made it this far in my story, I want to ask you something important, something I've thought about often in the years since that terrible, transformative wedding day. Have you ever had to choose between the easy path of walking away quietly and the harder path of standing your ground long enough to see the truth fully realized? I would love for you to share, in the comments below, a moment in your own life when patience and quiet strength ultimately mattered more than immediate reaction, because I believe so deeply that our stories, shared honestly with one another, are how we remind each other that healing is possible, that dignity can be reclaimed, and that even the most devastating betrayals do not have to define the rest of our lives. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment about the part that moved you most, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder today that second chances and quiet strength still exist in this world, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our community means more to me than I can properly express, and every single person who takes the time to watch, to comment, to share these stories with someone who needs them, becomes part of a larger family built on the belief that kindness, patience, and hope are never wasted, no matter how dark the beginning of the story might seem. I think often about that afternoon in Napa Valley, the golden light through those tall windows, the small red stain that changed everything I thought I knew about my life. I used to believe that moment was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Now, with the clarity that only distance and healing can provide, I understand it differently. That moment was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of finally becoming the woman I was always capable of being, patient enough to wait, strong enough to build something real out of devastation, and wise enough to know that the truest form of winning was never about destroying the man who hurt me. It was about refusing to let his betrayal become the thing that defined me, and choosing instead, deliberately and completely, to become someone I could finally, fully respect. Thank you for walking through this story with me today. Wherever you are, whatever storm you might be quietly outlasting right now, I hope you remember that your patience is not weakness, your quiet strength is not invisible, and your story, however painful its beginning, is still yours to finish writing exactly as you choose.